Got it. All right, so we're here today with Marc Molinaro, the Republican candidate, excuse me, for the 19th Congressional District. Thank you, Marc, for agreeing to sit down with us again. The last time you were here, you were also a candidate for the 19th Congressional District, although in a different district and against a different opponent. Now you're running in the 19th District, which spans 11 counties, stretching from the Mid-Hudson Valley and the Catskills all the way to Tompkins County in Western New York. As you know, your opponent, Democratic candidate Josh Riley, unfortunately was not able to participate in today's event, but we will be sitting down with him at a future date. So it's just going to be you today with us. We're going to try to follow the format that's similar to the one we've used in the past. I'll give you an opportunity to make your opening statement, and then I'll ask you questions and you'll answer them. And hopefully, since we only have one, we'll have an opportunity to perhaps explore those issues a little bit deeper. So I think with that, I'll give you 3 minutes if you need it to make your opening statement. Yvonne will keep time. We're going to keep it to an hour. So we're going to try to keep the answers short. But like I said, we'll have a little bit more opportunity to have some dialogue back and forth. So with that, please.
Sure. First, I appreciate it as always. And I do thank you, Patricia. You've covered me and you've covered this region for, well, as long as I've been in public service. And I only say that because the folks watching and the people reading know that I've spent every day of my adult life trying to make government actually work for people. And I'm running for Congress for the very same reasons I ran for village trustee in 1994 as an 18-year-old. I truly believe in public service. And I think that too often government and government officials ignore the people and the needs and challenges facing ordinary constituents, ordinary families, ordinary small businesses, farmers. And we see it, I think, in glaring detail today. Decisions made in Washington, single party rule without question, but still decisions made in Washington ultimately are making us more expensive and less safe. But the reason that I decided to truly run for this office at this time is I saw over the last several years, as many of us have seen throughout upstate New York, government turn its back on people. In fact, the most vulnerable among us, those who struggled with mental illness, those who struggle with substance use, those with disabilities, the most vulnerable, living paycheck to paycheck. You know, they were told over the last 2 years that certain people were essential, certain businesses were essential, and that decisions were made that ultimately made it difficult for them to thrive and survive. My own child saw this, living with a disability. I'm running for Congress because I want government, I want Washington to pay attention to the needs of ordinary people. I want it to work for us. That means confronting reckless spending that is driving up inflation. It means addressing energy policies so that we can drive down costs and still make a measurable difference in protecting our environment. It means confronting laws and policies that have all been in Washington that frankly are undermining public safety, and we see it every day. I've lived this over these last 11 years as county executive. I know what these decisions have done to undermine and erode our ability to provide for public safety and to ensure that people have opportunity to grow, to remain employed, and to pay their bills. I'm running for Congress because we see all too often politicians point at the other side and say, you're at fault, instead of trying to find ways to bring people together towards mutual solutions. I have experience doing this. I have a lifetime of doing this. And I believe that public service is, as Bobby Kennedy once said, a dignified duty. It is our job to bring people together to confront the problems that face America, face our state, and face this district. And I'm going to remain as committed and dedicated as ever, working hand in hand with local leaders, business leaders, community members, and residents to give them voice and to try to mold consensus around solutions to drive down our cost of living, to provide for public safety, and to create opportunity for our kids and families. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today.
Marc, it is a widespread assumption, and thank you for your comments. It is a widespread assumption that in January, the Republicans will take control of the House. In that majority, there will be many members, current members and members who will likely be elected, who believe that the election was stolen from the former president. Where do you stand on that issue, and how do you work with people who have differing beliefs such as that?
Yeah, so I've said this before, Joe Biden won the election and we're living with, I think, an ineffective and quite frankly, in many ways, incompetent administration. But here we are. And it's our job to work towards solutions. The other thing I'll tell you is, listen, we don't get to pick who other people elect. Voters all across America select their candidates based on whatever reasons, whatever determinations they have. I mean, sort of like saying, the folks in upstate New York, should they choose me? Are they lesser or are they smarter or less or not so much? At the end of the day, voters select the person they believe is best to represent them. And it's our obligation to work regardless of party, regardless of background, with whomever it is that is earnest about trying to solve problems. That said, I'm going to spend my energy trying to work with people who want to solve problems, the folks who want to govern, who want to drive down costs, want to confront inflation, energy costs, want to confront crime in our communities. And I'll work with Republicans and Democrats. Some of the things that I care deeply about are not at all marred by partisanship. Services for those with disabilities, trying to ensure everyone who has a mental wellness concern has access to mental health support, substance use, which is taking far too many lives and impacting far too many families. These are things where Republicans and Democrats have common ground, if only we have elected officials willing to work both across party lines and within their own party to move people towards solutions to address them.
Are there going to be those people in this coming up Congress? Because it seems like it's going to be very divided.
I'm glad it's the two of us. I will say out loud, with all due respect, my opponent has not decided to participate in these things together yet. So this is sort of a continued trend where it's just me having conversation. But for whatever reason, he's chosen not to participate in public forums together. This is what I would say to you. We have to. If you're sitting at home wondering, can we actually solve problems? Yes, we can. If we as voters and elected officials put the interest of the people we serve first, I know I'm going to do that. And there will be plenty of elected officials in Congress, in the state legislature, and local government who agree with that. And I'll work with them. I'll work with anyone honest and earnest about that. I've met so many terrific elected officials and have worked with tremendous elected officials and community leaders across the 19th district for 29 years. I know that we have the capacity to work across party lines and build a coalition. If I come to Washington with a bipartisan consensus around certain solutions, it makes us even more powerful in a day and age when things are far too partisan and divisive.
Republicans, and in particular, presumed Speaker Kevin McCarthy, have warned Democrats to be prepared for a number of investigations. They're going to investigate the DOJ for their handling of the Mar-a-Lago raid, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, Hunter Biden. Others have called to defund the FBI. What are your thoughts on more investigations and on separately defunding the FBI?
Well, first of all, I come to, should I be given the honor of serving Washington? Every dollar the federal government takes from taxpayers is going to be scrutinized. I can guarantee you. I've spent the last decade basically applying zero-based budgeting. I don't think government should assume that what they got last year is what they're going to take from you this year. And there are far too many families who at least expect us to scrutinize every dollar and to drive down costs. So I'm not targeting any department, but I will say that I think it's our obligation in Congress to actually question whether or not dollars spent are getting the results we expect. That's not a partisan question. That is, you're not willingly giving your tax money. The government's taking it from you. And we ought to be scrutinizing and asking very important questions, which gets to the first part of your question. Listen, Congress's job is to provide checks and balances. There have been no checks and balance under this single party rule in Washington. It's why, by the way, massive spending bills get done in the middle of the night with no oversight. It's why, by the way, the federal government spent hundreds of billions of dollars to help school kids all across America catch up for the lost learning they had during the pandemic, yet there's no oversight to determine whether or not we're getting anything in return and how those dollars are being spent effectively. It's why the use of federal money for things like private golf courses are things that ought to be scrutinized. At the end of the day, there needs to be checks and balances. And the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the use of funds to hire 87,000 IRS agents. All of this is supposed to be scrutinized, and there should be checks and balances. The fact that we've had single party rule in Washington and Albany has led to lack of accountability, lack of scrutiny, and corruption. And that is a fact. Here's the last that I offer. During the pandemic, there were real choices made that were truly cruel and, in my view, criminal. Seniors sent to nursing homes, knowing full well that their lives would be at risk. Those with disabilities denied actual support services. We ought to be asking what decisions were made, what can we learn from them, and how do we not repeat them? None of that is happening now because one party is trying to protect itself. I think that we ought to be protecting the American people.
But I'm sorry, go ahead, Yvonne.
Well, I just wanted to get to the question that Patty asked, which was specifically investigations on the DOJ raid on Mar-a-Lago, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and Hunter Biden and the Defund police. So we got four topics.
No, I understood what your question is. I'm not a member of Congress. My view is there ought to be checks and balances. If there are criminal activity that is underway or government has engaged in overreach, there ought to be the appropriate oversight. That's my view. There must be. I mean, anytime government acts to protect or to impose its will on anyone, there ought to be checks and balances, and that ought to be something we pursue.
How much of this constant investigation, and we've had investigations into everything, including Hunter Biden and emails,
including the last administration, including Republicans, including going after parents who go to school board meetings. There has been an overreach of the executive branch, and that all has to be held in check as well. I mean, with all due respect, you can call it an investigation, I'll call it oversight. At the end of the day, the checks and balances, the separation of these branches of government is absolutely critical to ensure that government doesn't impose its will when it doesn't have right to, that there's not waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse when there ought not to be, and that at least somebody's asking the tough questions. I'm sorry, I actually think that government oversight is important. I'm running for Congress because I think that the legislative branch of government ought to be providing oversight, and for the last 2 years, there's been none.
Do you support the call to defund the FBI?
I support an analysis of every dollar that's spent by federal government, including that which goes to the Defense Department, that which goes to law enforcement. And I've said this, I do think at the end of the day, there ought to be that kind of accountability to ensure that the FBI, the Department of Justice, Department of Education is all functioning within its jurisdiction and does not use partisan or political efforts to go after anybody. You should have a government you can trust. And at the end of the day, Congress's job is to provide oversight, and I will engage in that activity as well.
To move on, and actually it's kind of the follow-up, the economy, which you've mentioned several times. The economy is in a free fall. Food prices, gas prices, utility prices are through the roof, and middle-class people are struggling and wondering how in the world they're gonna put oil in their tanks this winter.
Yeah.
At the same time, crude oil today is $100 a barrel less than it was in 2008. And oil companies reporting record profits. In August, Exxon reported 17-point-something billion, with other major companies reporting double-digit profits as well. All the while, they're receiving government subsidies. What specifically do you think can be done and should be done to turn the table, one, on runaway inflation? And should and can the federal government take steps to rein in these oil companies who are clearly profiting mightily off of the American people?
Well, first, some of those profits, by the way, are the result of post-COVID federal subsidy. Keep that in mind. Not just the ordinary federal subsidy. The federal government gave these massive corporations the same, an enormous amount of money. You got $1,200, Pat, perhaps from the COVID relief. They gave them billions upon billions of dollars when it was unnecessary. Just like, by the way, they gave governments millions upon millions of dollars when we said it wasn't entirely necessary. So the federal government needs to take responsibility for shoveling your tax money into corporations. That's part of the massive profits that people talk about, importantly. But first, you have to acknowledge the fact that the economy is weak. The president just a day ago said that the economy and the American economy is strong, right? I think he said it's strong as hell or something like that. What kind of absurdity are we living in where you can't even acknowledge the fact that we are in the midst, the early stages of a recession? We are in a situation where inflation is crushing ordinary people. And at the same time, policies are driving up costs. So to be specific on energy costs specifically, first, send the message that we're going to refine and make use of American natural resources. Instead of buying from the very corporations and countries that either don't like us or we question that they have our interest in mind, why shouldn't we be in the position of at least projecting forward that we'll use American natural resources, oil and natural gas, instead of China, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia? Provide and make use of our resource. That, by the way, just a commitment to that, to make use of lands already leased for drilling and natural gas exploration, would send the message. And with that, because gas prices are forward thinking, begin to drive down costs. The other is policies, in particular here in New York, clean energy policies with noble intentions are forcing too much demand where there isn't enough supply. And so what we see in the state is this massive rush to electricity without the ability to provide both supply or distribution. That means costs are going up. Number three, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission was allowed to arbitrarily raise rates in New York State, and no member of Congress spoke up. You and I pay a base energy cost in this country because the federal government says this is the least you're going to pay. You know what? You want to know why our base rate went up 25%? To subsidize New York City energy generation. And that's bad enough, but they never did it. The state and federal government never compelled the very energy generators to actually create energy. So we're all now paying 25% higher simply because of state policy and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission adding costs. I want to hold them accountable. I want that decision could be changed instantly to drive down costs. Those are two things. And then the last, absolutely engage in protection against price gouging. That is something that both the federal and state government has the authority to do through the Department of Justice and the Attorney General, Department of Energy, Department of Justice, and the Attorney General's office. Engage in that, which is something that I've supported my entire adult life.
You mentioned a little bit of I guess it's a balance between the energy regulation and, climate change. We have you mentioned the climate state goals in the state. Given that there is that tension, how do we address the climate change issue with at the same time regulating, some or dealing with the crisis with the energy situation, right? With oil, fossil fuels, and stuff like that. We're trying to reduce oil, our dependence on these energy sources, but at the same time, we have this energy crisis. So how do you deal with that in Congress?
Well, I mean, first establishing goals that we can achieve in timeframes we can achieve them. And so this in particular in the Northeast, but very specifically in New York, the goal of full electrification, if you will, vehicles and homes otherwise, we don't have the infrastructure to support. We don't generate enough, and we don't have the lines, the towers, the poles, the cables to make that kind of transition. Invest in hardening that infrastructure. At the same time, the state and federal government has said that nuclear is not an option. That is ludicrous. You have a scenario where 85% of energy consumption in upstate New York is green energy. It is renewable because it's hydro and nuclear. New York City is exactly the opposite, 90% through fossil fuels. Why? Because the federal government and the state government don't have an all of the above policy. They won't allow natural gas as a transition, and they're turning their back on nuclear as something that is clean and can be safe if we maintain it appropriately. Using those tools, you then invest the federal infrastructure dollars, the money that they're taking out of your pocket to go into energy generation should be going to hardening and improving the distribution system and new energy generation. And then I'll just say as an aside, if you live in the Hudson Valley, and I think if you live anywhere in New York, you should be concerned. But if you live in the Hudson Valley, the state of New York's response to the fact that New York City is benefiting from us paying, Hudson Valley, Catskills paying high rates and having clean energy. Not only are they doing that, they're saying that we should take energy generated from hydro in Canada and run in a giant extension cord down the middle of the Hudson River. You're worried about climate change, so am I. I'm worried about water quality. After spending the last 40, 50 years fighting to clean the Hudson River, the fact that the response by Albany and by extension the federal government to turn up the Hudson River in exchange for a giant cord from, I'm using that facetiously, from Canada to New York City should frighten and concern us. Let's have policies that make sense with timelines we can achieve, and then let's effectively use federal and state dollars to make that transition, in particular in this region, to harden the infrastructure to allow it.
Just as a follow-up to that, you are well aware, and I don't know if there's a role for the federal government in this, and I'm going to ask you if there is. You are aware of the difficulties that folks in this region in particular have faced with Central Hudson. It's been bought by a Canadian company with billing and outrageous bills and no bills. I don't know about you, Mark. I haven't gotten a bill from Central Hudson in 4 months.
Yeah, a friend of mine has the same experience.
Is there a role for the federal government in dealing with that? Because clearly Albany has been unsuccessful.
Well, you got to, why more investigations? First of all, certainly the Department of Energy and the Regulatory Commission has some capacity to provide oversight, and even just asking the question tends to get response. So one, appropriate oversight, and having lived and worked in upstate New York, I know these people, Pat. This is a distinguishable difference between me and my opponent. I know the people who work in these companies. I know the local officials. I know the Public Service Commission. We can compel them to pay attention, and there ought to be appropriate oversight. This billing strategy that went into effect should never have been allowed to begin with. These estimated billing, you should be charged for what you use. And to think that we don't have the technology to do this, it's because we don't invest in the infrastructure to have it happen. But that said, appropriate oversight without question, leverage, I think, both the ability of a member of Congress to press on both Central Hudson and, by the way, the other service providers, and then to compel the federal and state regulatory agencies to engage is critically important. But again, in this country, these companies are mostly overseen by the state, and to simply throw up our hands and say, well, since they couldn't do it, someone else should. How about the state of New York do its damn job? I mean, honestly, there are people freezing and can't pay their bills, worried that they're going to get a $5,000 or $10,000 bill after months of never getting anything, is absurd. And I've heard politicians say, well, they compelled the PSC to do this, or how about a solution? The solution should be that the state of New York does its job. The Public Service Commission immediately takes action to hold these businesses responsible, but then looks inward. The state of New York is driving up the underlying cost of energy generation, and that needs to be confronted as well.
We do a lot of talking about the state of New York, and I think we're going to continue here for a second. You've been a real vocal critic of New York's bail reform laws. You said decisions in Washington and New York are making life unsafe. I'm curious to know, how are New York's bail reform laws, which are sort of specific to New York, how are they a federal issue?
First, they're not specific to New York, and this is another difference between me and my opponent. He embraces cashless bail and bail reform. He supports halt and raise the age and the discovery reforms. He can spin it any way he wishes. He supports the policies that are truly making it difficult for us to provide for public safety. No exaggerated rhetoric. Beyond that, the federal Democrats in Congress have embedded bail reform in federal legislation. And the reason that should concern people is right now, district attorneys, law enforcement, and communities like ours, right? I'm engaged in the criminal justice as a county executive. Because of New York's laws, we often turn to federal prosecutors to step in, because New York's laws are so weak that we might need federal. We might try to find a federal law that we can prosecute so that we can hold someone and keep them off the streets. If the federal government were to back down and make change to their own bail system, you'd have a compounding and cascade of problems that, by the way, we wouldn't be able to respond to. We could no longer say we could keep you safe. Right now, we're having a hard enough time doing that. So that's number one. Number two, though, is the federal government could provide resources, as Republicans across the country have said. I believe that we ought to move forward, not with small funding for law enforcement agencies, but rather the commitment to ensure that we're supporting community policing across America. And that, by the way, is using the tools that we've used in Dutchess County: crisis intervention training, mental health first aid, implicit bias training, making sure that law enforcement has body cameras, not just one agency here or there, but everybody. Make sure the federal government's giving all the tools necessary to ensure that we don't have two systems of justice, poor versus rich, and that law enforcement, prosecutors, and public defense have the tools necessary. We're already funding, we're just not doing it effectively to ensure that all aspects of the criminal justice system are appropriately supported. But I know we have these short times, and maybe you're going to ask me again about bail reform. Bail reform is a disaster. It is a disaster. When you compound it with discovery reform and raise the age, what New York has done, and less is more, what New York has done is said, first of all, it's created a disincentive for law enforcement to do its job. Discovery, the burden of discovery means lower offenses can't be acted on because they don't have the tools or resources to build the case for a lesser offense. Bail reform means that regardless of risk, regardless of potential reoffense, you may never come before an arraignment judge, and you will never have an intervention effort, and you'll never have the protection that's necessary. Less is more means after you've aged out, you're no longer on parole, you're just out in the community. And so you saw this, all the tools that we put in place in Dutchess that did over 8 years reduce incidents of violent crime 42% over 8 years. We did that through tools and resources to law enforcement, community policing, intervention and diversion services to help the offender, keep them from reoffense, alternatives to incarceration, to monitor appropriately out on the street those who are on probation or parole, and then the tools to ensure that we kept victims safe. All of that has been thrown aside.
So then we're gonna keep moving on. We're actually doing pretty good, I think. Abortion. I know we've had this conversation before, but I do want to sort of look at it a little bit more in depth and clarify your position a little bit. You've stated that you're pro-life, but that you support abortion under certain circumstances. What exactly are those circumstances?
Well, first, to your point earlier about Congress versus state, what the Supreme Court decided is that Congress doesn't have the same role it had when Roe v. Wade was decided. So now we're in a situation where Congress can't, and I will not support Congress taking action to ban abortion nationwide. There is no capacity for Congress to do that, and I do not support a national ban. Secondly, I do support ensuring that in states like New York, where the right is broad, that is preserved and protected. There should be no effort to undermine New York's laws because New York has the right under the Dobbs decision to impose its decision. Now, where I end is this. I know that we're not going to necessarily come to her absolute agreement, but I do believe there is commonality. I think there is common ground. I think most people agree that at the very least in the final trimester, there should be at least limits on abortion to life of the mother, rape, and incest. That's where I land. Make sure that women still have the right to access services. Make sure that the federal government doesn't impose a national ban, so that access to choice remains. And then at the very least, we begin a conversation, I think importantly, about late-term abortion, and at least acknowledging that it ought to be limited. And that's the final trimester. It at least ought to be limited to the case of life of the mother, rape, and incest. Now, the last thing I do want to say is, here's one I'm going to throw at you. In the state of New York and in other states across the country, rape is a very, very serious crime and ought to be. Incest is rape, and yet the criminal code treats incest as a lesser offense. In my estimation, incest should be treated as rape, and we should make it perfectly clear that those two things are not different in our society, and send a very clear message that that is unacceptable in America and in New York. And I do say this only because, and I mean this sincerely, I understand that what Dobbs did was undo generations, 3 generations now of what we thought was settled law. I thought it was settled law. We are obligated now to show our support to women who have to make a very difficult choice, to love them no matter what choice they make, and ensure that as a society, we have the support necessary: prenatal, neonatal, contraception, and support for those that choose to bring children into this world with any number of difficulties.
You say that you won't, and you've been very clear that you will not support Congress taking any action to institute a federal ban on abortion. Would you support any legislation that would make it a federal right?
Well,
which would be the converse, right?
Well, you would need a constitutional amendment. You would need a constitutional amendment, which starts from the states. Listen, I'm actually open to having the public have that conversation broadly, and I do think that the Dobbs decision provides us at least a place to have that dialogue. And so, I've said this again. I do think early in the pregnancy, certainly that right and access should be maintained. Generally speaking, that's in the first 17 weeks should be maintained broadly. That said, that's an open conversation that I don't necessarily think Congress can impose, but I'm giving you from my heart what I believe. There ought to be access, and we ought not take action to ban nationally. But I do think we have to have a serious conversation about, at least, again, limiting late term in the case of life of the mother, rape and incest. And I would also say, and maybe you're going to get that opportunity to talk to my opponent, why not that? I mean, why his position is well beyond what most Americans think is acceptable. At some point, you do have to ask, why is it okay in the last seconds of pregnancy, except in those exceptions, other than some statement otherwise? Why would we allow a child born, even if the abortion didn't go as planned, to simply die on a tray? These are at least questions that I think we ought to be talking about. Just talk about them sensitively, but we ought to have those conversations.
When we say life
but
of
is
the mother,
that happening? But is that happening?
California has a bill that would allow it. I just think that these are the kinds of things that we should just talk about. I mean, we've gotten to a point, we started this entire conversation with, well, can people get along? If we can't talk about these things at all, and we simply say to the other side, well, you have no right, or we dismiss or cancel or whatever the term is these days, to say an opposing view is unacceptable. I said this to you last time we were together. It used to be safe, rare, and legal. At least let's have that conversation about what's changed in society that we want to ensure women have access to support, and ultimately that we're loving and respectful of differing opinions.
One of the things that was, I guess, brought up before, like a long time ago, I remember when it was like, the line was to make abortion rare and
safe and legal.
Safe and legal. When the suggestion is to put certain limits, like life of the mother and rape and incest, there are other circumstances where a doctor may think is necessary that's not codified. One of the reasons why it's suggested to be open like that is to allow for those instances, right? Isn't there a risk that putting these limits would, as it's called, the law of unintended consequences, right? That there's a certain necessity for somebody to have an abortion, and now that there's this law, you wouldn't be allowed to have it.
Yvonne, I've given you my view. What I will say to you is that 18 years ago, if somebody knew that my daughter was going to come into the world, they could identify the loss of blood, the scarring of her brain. If they could have identified that earlier, they may have said that she had no chance of survival. 18 years ago, I wouldn't have asked for a child with a disability. At the very least, she deserves to have come into this world to change the opinion and view of her father of life, of those that struggle with disabilities, and to have the ability to interact. All I'm saying is, at the end of the day, we ought to at least talk about it and at least have a sensitive conversation about it. But I want to say this again. My opponent, Josh Riley, has spent millions of dollars over the last 3 weeks lying about my position. And I'm not the one saying that. The Times Union has said it. The New York Post has said it. And just today, CNN has said it. He is lying about my position to frighten women into thinking that I don't care deeply. I do. I want us to have a sensitive conversation about both what we think the limits ought to be and what the consequences of those decisions are. I was at a wonderful presentation some years ago at the group out in Clinton, where pro-life and Clinton, New York, pro-life and pro-choice women came together and had a thoughtful conversation. We should be able to do that again, and to say to women everywhere, we support you no matter what choice you make, and that we care deeply about ensuring that we respect one another.
Mark, I'm going to actually follow up on that question with, you brought up your daughter, and so I want to bring up your Think Differently efforts in Dutchess County, a program that you launched early on in your career as county executive. I'm wondering, I mean, obviously this has been replicated in counties across the state. I'm wondering how and if, let me rephrase that, I'm wondering if you plan to attempt to bring something like that into Washington with you, and how you see that kind of taking shape if you do.
Yeah, the way we treat those with disabilities is cruel. They are treated as second-class citizens, physical, intellectual, and developmental disabilities, second-class citizens. And during the pandemic, they were targeted. They were targeted by the state and federal government to not receive certain supports. We were told not to help them with government resources by Andrew Cuomo, and nobody stood up except us. And there are plenty of county leaders across the state who know that I made this a very specific priority until that idiot, Larry Schwartz, you can quote me, finally backed down and said that we could begin providing support for those with disabilities. That said, the very first piece of legislation I intend to draft is to expand the reach of Think Differently nationwide. And what that means is a broader commitment to special education. No one should have to fight to get special education support. Federal government underfunds and limits access to special education. That, by the way, denies quality education of those with disabilities, but also, by the way, arbitrarily raises school property taxes. There needs to be a commitment both in Medicaid and Medicare, and a demand that private health insurances cover the direct care support necessary for two reasons. One, these are life-affirming supports. It could be occupational therapy, it could be physical therapy, it could be direct care. Those supports need to be universally funded and supported without question. We're denying entire people without access to their civil and human rights. And we simply, unless you live it, you don't know it. We need to ensure that there are broader access to job opportunities. That means giving the private and public sector the ability to carve out job responsibilities that meet specific capacity or abilities of individuals with disabilities. There needs to be a secondary education program nationwide for those with disabilities. So few have access to college degree programs. That's why we launched Think Ahead in Dutchess. Jobs, 87% of those with disabilities are unemployed, yet they have absolute capacity to provide real benefit, and we'd be providing employers with willing and capable and able employees. And then, by the way, housing and independence. Moving forward, the fact that the federal government provides billions of dollars nationwide to subsidize housing nationwide, we ought to make sure that there is much broader access and support to individual and independent living. And the very last thing I'll say is that based on the New York State's determination of what's referred to as the Olmstead Act, this was, in essence, this extension of individual rights. There are entire villages like Camp Hill Village, which is a nationwide model. They can't receive the same direct Medicaid support because it's singularly inclusive. You live, you grow, you work there. New York State says that's a violation of the Olmstead Act. At the end of the day, whatever access and support, whatever independence you can achieve, we should be funding, because we're denying people their dignity, and we're overburdening families. Families like mine give up two people working, or they have to advocate only at night for their child or for their adult with disabilities. This is something that Think Differently has changed the culture of how we confront and support those with disabilities. And America ought to be taking notice, and it is something that I'm going to spend a great deal of time focusing on.
Thank you. I think that's the first time I've heard that, so that's kind of interesting that that'll be your first legislation.
Yeah.
Immigration.
Yeah.
Clearly, our immigration system is broken, and
Yep.
It has been for decades. It's been an issue that has been left unresolved by every Congress, whether controlled by Republicans, controlled by Democrats, regardless of who's in the White House, whether we've had, one party controlling the White House, one party controlling Congress. It's just been impossible to solve. What needs to be done, and how do you fix it?
Well, I'm not I don't, no one person is going to come to the table with the solution. We do have to secure the border. there cannot be some excuse for that not happening. We've had 2 million individuals cross the border over the last year and a half illegally. And with all due respect, the White House is moving people who come into this country in the dark of night into communities and community support structures all across America. We see it, by the way, in Dutchess, and we see it in other parts of the state without any transparency. That's a mistake. Treating people like they're chattel, at least officially by the federal government, isn't a good idea. But it's because they've allowed this humanitarian crisis to occur. Start by ensuring that the border is secure and we provide humanitarian assistance there. That's where we ought to be providing the aid and the assistance, and then working with other countries to ensure that we're limiting this kind of continued pressure on illegal immigration. I want to talk about illicit drugs coming in, but I'll separate it since your question is specifically about immigration. Start there. That's a powerful message to those who are concerned about border security, to then also begin the conversation about broader immigration policy. I think the only way it gets solved is with a Republican House and a Democrat Senate or Democrat president. In other words, a split government is the only way you're going to come to some kind of compromise. Otherwise, the Democrats would have done it already. Why haven't they? So I just would say secure the border and then start looking at how we treat legal immigration. The naturalization system takes too long. It's too cumbersome. Place-based immigration and workforce-driven immigration needs to be confronted, and the system to get temporary into permanent workers needs to be enhanced. I've always supported that. And I referenced place-based immigration. That's where, by the way, you might identify whole communities of people who could come into this country from some other country into a single location to work in a town or a community that needs to have that kind of support, new workforce. These are things, by the way, that modern countries use in order to relieve the pressure on sort of the illegal immigration and begin a broader conversation about what kind of immigration policy we ought to be looking at in the future. So place-based, allowing individuals to come in based on work needs, temporary, and then transition to permanent workforce, in particular in the agricultural community throughout upstate New York, very important. Border security, and then a naturalization system that isn't as cumbersome and bureaucratic as it is today. These are my opinions.
What does border security look like to you?
It's both physical and technological security, just as we would at any other asset we own. We have a park. You might use a fence and a wall. You might use cameras and response. The same is true at both the southern and northern borders. There's little question that physical structure is necessary in certain places. This is why, by the way, the president doesn't say he's not for it. In fact, in some cases, they're continuing to build it, although not adequately enough. And then in other locations, we have technology and resources like border security, border enforcement, that if they receive the tools necessary, could, in a very humane way, enforce the law at the border. And then by augmenting our human services, right, addressing the human crisis needs, instead of bringing people into the country to get those sort of supports, we can do that at the border effectively and humanely. And that would begin to relieve the pressure that's built up at the border. But it is a crisis, whether the president wants to say so or not. It is a crisis, and we see it every day. And it does a disservice. Pat, it does a disservice to the country, and it does a disservice to the people trying to enter.
You talked about we see it in Dutchess with people being brought in the dark of night, and I'm presuming you're referring to the 2 planes that were just brought into Stewart Airport.
No, for the last several years, and by the way, this has not been limited only to this administration. We've had both adults, although in most cases we have unaccompanied minors. Unaccompanied minors, to me, is heartbreaking. But when they come into the community, we are required in certain ways to provide certain services through state mandates. There is no communication from the federal government, and so there's no knowledge as to what services that are needed. And so, I don't think, by the way, children should be used as pawns in this conversation. What should happen is the federal government ought to be talking to local governments like ours about who's coming in and what needs are to be addressed, and then how do we make that sort of transition as safe as possible? What screening has been conducted? What background is being conducted? What efforts to find parents is being conducted? We don't know any of that. We don't even know where ultimately they're placed. We think we do, but we do know. I mean, we think we do, but we're never told. And so that kind of lack of transparency is problematic.
That is part of you mentioned that it was brought up in several administrations because it's part of the Flores Amendment, right? When it comes Flores settlement in 1997, and has been which deals with the treatment of minors, basically. Border Patrol cannot keep them for more than 72 hours. They have to be given to HHS, which sends them to facilities and places, families, sometimes
through the Office of Refugee Resettlement, right?
Right. And then they end up coming here. Now, you're saying that they are not giving local governments enough notice or even telling them
any notice. Or any notice. I mean, what we know,
the facilities that are taking them are given notice, right? I mean,
I assume the facility is, although again, what we learned over the last couple of months is that those organizations get limited notice, but they get something. I mean, I assume it's hours, but no, local government. And keep in mind, in New York State in particular, and you say federal, state, in New York State, the federal government allows New York State to run its social services programming. This is the entities responsible for care at some point for a decentralized system. You got 57 county governments, one happens to be the city of New York, who administer these services at the local level. Because of that decentralization, we're the ones providing the ultimately the access to government care, state mandated, without the ability to know until well after individuals are relocated. And again, I'm not sounding some alarm when it comes to kids. That's very sensitive, and it ought to be treated with sensitivity. What I'm saying is that there's lack of communication between the federal and local governments. Maybe there's conversation with the state government, but we wouldn't know that either.
We're keeping with that threat with the minors, because that is immigration that is not based on work's need. All of a sudden you have a bunch of minors coming in. There was this program, the DACA thing, which has expired now, and the idea would be to allow, as they call them, dreamers, people who were minors when they came in here. They didn't come here voluntarily when they were babies or 2 years old or 4 years old. They've been here for a long time, and because it was passed through the executive branch, it has, gone back and forth with expiring, not expiring. Do you think that Congress should pass some sort of program that would allow like this type of immigrants to be a path to citizenship?
Well, the question I would ask is, why hasn't the one party that's been ruling in Washington already taken action? And secondly, again, I'm happy to have a broad conversation about immigration policy if we commit to securing the border. And that is an important first step. And it also, by the way, puts at ease, I think, a lot of concern regarding both humanitarian crisis pressure, and then we didn't get to it, but some of the illegality that does ultimately find its way into this country.
And I was going to actually lead into that. So opioid crisis is a crisis. And it's started, we can sort of trace it back to Big Pharma maybe, but it's gone well beyond that. Fentanyl is flowing in over the borders, or so we're told. How do we address the opioid crisis in this country? And how do we address not just the importing of these drugs, but the domestic production? And how do we deal with the people who are becoming addicted to these opioids?
And I got 3 minutes to answer that.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, I know.
First, though, we do have to stop the illicit flow into the country. Fentanyl is coming in, synthetic fentanyl is coming into this country principally illegally from China to cartels to America. Some of it is coming in over our borders, over open borders. Some of it coming through ports of entry. We have to take seriously and by the way, provide more support for that kind of security, both at our ports of entry and our borders. We're only probably capturing a fraction of what we know is illegally coming in. And that has to be made clear. The second is the president should make very clear with China that this continued assault on America is not acceptable. It is an assault on America. This is illicit, a synthetic production that we know is occurring in China cannot continue. Secondly, in our country, there needs to be a broad commitment to enforcement on the street, which is why, by the way, again, bail reform and other policies in this state make it difficult to intervene with lower level offenses. And so you might be in the food chain of selling or buying or trafficking illicit drugs, and you'll be able to continue to do it in this country, in this state, because we don't have effective means to get you off the street. We can't even threaten jail time because of it. That's a mistake. Sorry, but the tools we use to provide for public safety sometimes means that we have to be very clear with people who are violating the law. We can't do that in New York. So what we've committed to is as much funding as necessary, the funding necessary to some 200,000 law enforcement agents across the country. That's local police. And I suggest doing something very similar to what Dutchess County has done, which is fully funding drug task forces, which in many communities are multiple police agencies working independently. There needs to be a concerted effort to fund coordinated drug trafficking intervention through law enforcement. Technology has to be leaned upon. We don't have the ability to communicate. Most police agencies can't communicate beyond their jurisdiction, perhaps to the county level, but certainly not beyond that. The federal government ought to be funding the tools necessary to create this streamlined interoperability in communication. So if you're trafficking across state lines, it's easier for law enforcement, local law enforcement that has to intervene, to be able to communicate and to respond. That's critically important. So enforcement is necessary. On the other side, we have to engage more in prevention and intervention tools, which is what Dutchess County has done. We are the model that counties like Ulster and Broome County are now using across the state. The former governor, Andrew Cuomo, in fact, replicates Dutchess County's intervention tools that are to be used now and funded statewide, and we have others across the country using it. That means that you need to have broad access to treatment whenever you want it. So that's education and prevention through Narcan, recovery coaches, on the streets working with people who have lived through substance use. It's stabilizations and treatment centers like the one we have 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's mandating and requiring Medicaid, Medicare, and health insurance companies to provide not short-term treatment, but long-term treatment. There shouldn't be a question about that. And if we do it broadly, Medicare, Medicaid, health insurance, you'll be able to mitigate the individual cost impacts. If you only do it in a negligible way, premiums go up. If you do it broad-based, the larger the pool, the better off you are. Congress has the capacity to address some of this, as does the state. Lastly, so intervention, prevention tools. Lastly, holding pharmaceuticals. Dutchess County was one of the first counties in New York to move forward with litigation against the pharmaceutical companies. We did it with Albany and Erie County. Ulster County came on board. We made clear that the abuses that they took led to the loss of lives. Further, New York State only about 6 or 8 years ago began even training doctors as to the poison and the power of addiction. Addiction treatment, addiction understanding, and addiction control needs to be broad-based and understood. And access to that information needs to be available not only to physicians, but to you and me, so that we can be effective partners with a family member, a loved one living with addiction and substance use disorder, and provide access to the tools necessary to help.
Mark,
I have a whole policy paper on this. It's very important. You can look at it in detail. I've talked about it in detail because I think what we've done in this county is great. We need to do more, and we need to do it nationally. And my hope is to be able to give them the opportunity to do that.
How do you do that, though, when states control their Medicare programs? New York State has what some would consider a very robust Medicaid program. Other states, particularly in the South, have far less offerings, far fewer people are eligible, and it makes it difficult, it would seem to me, to do this broad brush. If in the state of Florida, if you're an able-bodied adult, you're not eligible for Medicaid, but in New York, you are.
Well, no, there's different. So
unemployed.
the base application remains the same, but then the federal government says, here's your base Medicaid, your core Medicaid services, and then you can offer all these optional things. And this gets back to where we started. You said, we talked about investigations and oversight. The federal government, this is federal law. They're using a federal program that the federal government is funding 50% of to provide a service. New York, by the way, and again, I'm very passionate about this. What New York has done, in my estimation, is violating Medicaid law. You don't have equity of access throughout the state because it's a decentralized system. So at the very least, saying to states like New York, if you're going to offer broad access to everything, then every citizen, regardless of where they live, need to have the same access, the same equality of access. Secondly, the federal government can amend the federal law to ensure that it covers the kinds of things we think is necessary. Now, we're not saying every state ought to provide I'm not saying every state ought to provide all optional services, but when it comes to that which is subsidized for mental health and substance use, there's such a limited option. We can simply say we have to provide this broadly. There needs to be broader access. Mental health and substance use treatment ought to be on the same equal playing field as physical health. And by simply saying that, you're expanding the pool of risk as well, which would keep costs down and provide broader access. And we should be imposing the same expectation on health insurance. It doesn't have to happen overnight, but it does have to happen. And I think you start by supporting the kinds of community-based tools that Dutchess County has nationwide. Use the settlement dollars through the pharmaceutical litigation to implore it. Don't allow governors like Kathy Hochul, who has threatened it, to use the dollars the way they want. Make sure the dollars get out into the communities effectively, and make sure every dollar we spend is measured. If you're using Medicaid and Medicare for these purposes, let's be sure that we're getting the result. And if we're not, we ought to change what we're spending money on to get the result we want. We need lesser people falling prey to addiction and more treatment to ensure those living with mental health and substance use disorder have the support they need to survive.
If I can
support the federal legalization of marijuana?
I have no objection to it at this point. I don't know the mechanism for that to happen. I do think that we ought to be very careful. I'm very upset that I answered it that way, because I know what your headline tomorrow is going to be. Molinaro this. I just will say very candidly, I think we've moved to the point where it should be decriminalized nationwide without question. And by the way, I think that other than objecting to the timing, the president's effort to in essence keep those who are dealing with marijuana related crimes, we've gotten to the point where decriminalization nationwide is simply what is more appropriate.
On the lightning round period of things,
I don't do lightning round, but I'm glad you think you're going to get away with it.
But I wanted to ask, because you mentioned oversight plenty of times. But you've also in the past have mentioned that you're opposed to oversight, say, by the IRS, or adding more agents to oversight, you could argue, abuse, or that there's been a lot of abuse. People have to, like you've seen it with the COVID money. There's been a lot of stuff, and some of these the federal government is arguing that some of these agents are replacing the ones who are retired, and others to investigate all this abuse. So how do you reconcile these two?
Well, they're two entirely different things, although using the same word. One is the legislative branch is responsible for providing constitutional oversight for the executive and judicial, and that's a responsibility. I am always concerned about government using its power to impose its will on people. And so frightening people into submission is no way to run a government. And that does happen. With all due respect, I saw when small businesses were told you must pay unemployment debts of Albany in New York, and that's now costing them millions of dollars. I saw when they were threatened, farms and small businesses threatened by government for not collecting and paying enough in sales tax, and they would say, well, just pay half of it and then we'll let you off the hook. That's extortion. That's not oversight. And we had this happen about a decade ago. There is no problem that is going to be solved by 87,000 IRS agents. I'm sorry, the IRS is large enough to do its work. The problem is that the federal and state government allow for so much administrative oversight and administrative expense and bureaucracy that it doesn't get to actually serving people. There is no excuse that the IRS had sufficient staff, sufficient resources to do its job. We don't demand that the government do its job. At my level of government, we do. When I was told you couldn't shrink the county workforce to the smallest in 35 years, they told me we wouldn't be able to provide services, and yet we did. And all I would say to you is before we ask people to take money out of their pockets to hire the very people who are going to be empowered to take the money out of their pockets, we ought to be demanding efficiency and effectiveness from the federal government. And last, I would just say, Yvonne, there are 87,000 other things that I'd like us to focus on. Honestly, if we have the money to restore 87,000 human beings and IRS and tax agents, I'd rather us focus on counselors in schools, police in our communities, social direct care staff for those with disabilities. If we have the resources to have done that, there are other priorities. And those priorities come first to people who are struggling really hard, really hard. So I can't embrace that kind of expense when we know there's so many people who need help and their challenges are going unanswered.
Mark, I have one more question, if you don't mind.
We're now at an hour and 2 minutes, but go ahead.
We're at an hour and 1 minute. I've got one more question, and I'm going to let you close and let you go, and I appreciate your time. You've issued a couple of releases criticizing your opponent and his so-called roots to the community, to the Hudson Valley, or to the state, actually. If you're elected, you will not be living in the 19th Congressional District. Will you be moving into it?
Yes, I will reside in the 19th Congressional District. And beyond that, I've spent the last 29 years working with the communities of upstate New York. Ironically, my opponent was in Germantown just a few days ago. Germantown, as you know, is where most of my friends grew up. It is a part of the district that since this is what he likes to say, I guess he'd call it downstate. But if you know this part of the district, you know that Tivoli, Red Hook, Columbia County, Ulster County, we shop together, we socialize together, our resources, our culture, our communities all work together. But beyond that, I've spent every day of my adult life in this region of the state, fighting for this region of the state. When I ran for governor, I ran because upstate New York doesn't have a voice. Josh Riley will be just one more person who had turned his back on New York and then decides to return 17 years later to buy himself a congressional seat. So I'm going to be pointed. He came back to the state of New York to run against somebody else in an entirely different district. Redistricting has thrown us all in a loop. I get that, but I'm committed to the people of this district. I'm committed to the communities of this district. My entire record has been one of trying to drive down property taxes, ensure that upstate has the services and support from a government that too often ignores them. And I've helped to rebuild an economy when major employers have walked away. So the voters of this district have every right to consider both of us. Someone who has served and committed to serving this district, someone who will move into this district, or someone who's lived in Washington and Miami for the last 17 years. That's the distinction.
All right, thank you. And so I promised you'd have an opportunity to make a closing statement, and now it is. I do want to say before I give you that opportunity, though, that we appreciate you taking the time with us today. It's been very informative. We've been able to cover an awful lot of topics and get to really sort of get in depth and an understanding of where you stand on many important issues that you'll face when you go to Washington, if you go to Washington. So with that, thank you very much. And I'll give you your closing time.
Yeah. When I was a kid, I watched my mom struggle as a single mother. I watched her stand in line at a social services department as some bureaucrat made her life difficult, and she felt a lesser person. We were supported by food stamps. Fast forward 20 years later, and not only am I responsible now for that very social services department, but I see the same angst, the same anguish, and the same fear in the faces of moms and dads all across this part of New York. At the same time, I saw a government that turned its back on kids like my own, and frankly expect them to somehow fend for themselves, handcuff teachers to laptops, and tell seniors that they wouldn't get the care or support they deserve. I know that you're sitting at home thinking, these guys all say the same thing. It's just more partisan and political, and it doesn't seem like anything can be resolved. I have spent every day of my adult life living with the lessons that I learned as a kid, the lessons that I live as a dad, and the experience I now have as a public official, trying to get government to pay attention to you, to confront the challenges that you face, to solve the problems that you have. And for all of these years, I've had successes and lessons learned. I'm running to represent you in Congress because I care deeply about this state and about this nation and about our future. And we have the opportunity, I know we do, to set aside differences, to work together towards solutions. I want to be that representative for you, someone who doesn't blame the other side, but rather rallies people together to try to confront the challenges that face us, to drive down costs, provide for public safety, and to create opportunity for our kids. We need a voice who has never given up on us. And I promise you, I never will.
Okay, thank you very much for your time, Mark. And I'm sure we'll be talking again. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Best to you both. Thank you.
Thank you.